of peoples. Is the center in Cote d'Ivoire, or are you from Cote d'Ivoire? He will explain.
Thank you very much for the floor. Yeah, I do Yannickes, Russian original from Cote d'Ivoire. So, as just my colleague said, I'm the black Russian. So, okay, thank you very much. Coming to the topic, as we don't have a lot of time, in order to answer to all discussion, I will try to organize my idea around the different periodization of Russian-African cooperation. So I built just my idea about the first relations that date from the Russian Empire and then USSR and then the Russian Federation as a new country. Yeah, as also the legacy of the, previous both countries that I mentioned. So the first period, as I mentioned, that is the period that preceding 1970s. Why? Because, of course, after the revolution, before the revolution, usually people used to limit the relation between Russia and African countries only from the Soviet period. That is not true, because historically, Russia, empire, had also a good relation with African countries, and particularly, for example, Ethiopia. Yeah, you know that already at the end of the 18th century, there was already ties between Ethiopia and Russian Empire. But that Ethiopia that you have, that is not Ethiopia that we have today. That Ethiopia include all the Horn of Africa, including the new, also appearing countries in this region. So, and also we know that in 1898, between Ethiopia and Russia was also, empire was established diplomatic ties from this period. So in 2023, the countries, Russia and Ethiopia, celebrate the 125 years of cooperation. So limited the relation between African countries and Russia just from the Soviet period is not so true. So also at the same time, we noted also the presence of also the diaspora of the Russian Empire also in the northern part of Africa also, particularly, for example, from Tunisia and also Egypt and so on. So just to say that the relation between both peoples, Russian and African peoples, has not limited only from the Soviet period. And then the second period from 1917 to 1991. Of course, that is the most famous period because recognized by everyone, and that period is very significant because it's the period that really Soviet Union, cooperate, directly and strongly with the African countries, and then also, as we know. After the Second World War particularly, the victory opened a new perspective for the colonial peoples in the struggle also for independence. So in addition for that, also the USSR that provide also significant assistance for the people of Asia, Africa, and Latin America in the struggle also for the natural inalienable right of freedoms. So the contribution of the USSR also to the liberation of the African people also divide into the following important sphere: political sphere, the economic and humanitarian sphere, and so on. So in point of political and diplomatic support also from the USSR was provided to various people liberation movements that we have here today. Many of our colleagues mentioned, for example, the cooperation between Russia and South Africa, the support today, South African movement for freedom and so on. So already in 1960s, for example, 17 African countries also gained independence. Yeah, therefore we call it that 1960, the year of the Africa. Yeah. In addition, the position of the USSR in the UN also created, after the Second World War also, was also very important in terms of cooperation, because it's front of Russian position. USSR at that time, the Declaration on the granting independence to the colonial countries was also adopted. So in terms of diplomatic cooperation and political support from the USSR within the UN was also something very significant. So and also another point that need to be also mentioned is the support. If we come to the, I mean, we are talking about the humanitarian aspect. That also the military, for example, cooperation between or support even from the Soviet Union to many African countries. Yeah, we have the Angola, South Africa, Mozambique, Namibia, Zimbabwe, and so on. I will not go to mention all of this. We know about it. And then in terms of social infrastructure and so on, many countries also receive help from the Soviet Union. At that time, we have, for example, in Mali, in Guinea, in Egypt, and so on. So all these also facts are really known. So thousands of people also from various new emerging African countries also was also trained in the Soviet time in Russia. According to Irina Abramova, the director of the Russian Academy of African Studies, more than 700,000 of African especially was also prepared by the Soviet Union at that time. So today, for example, also in Russia, we have more than 34,000 African students that are also studying in different Russian universities. So, and then we can also move to the third period and the last period from 1991 to this present time. Also, of course, of the beginning, from this time, I mean, from 1991, the situation was a little complicated, after particularly relating to the collapse of the Soviet Union at that time. But within the time, and thanking also from the coming on the power to the President Vladimir Putin, everything has been changed by these last decades. As we know, yeah, Russia continued to increase his support to African countries in different spheres also. Yeah, and then also diplomatic ties also are also increasing. Yeah, and this way also, as I mentioned, by this last year only, for example, from this academic year from 2024 to 2025, more than 4,000, about 5,000 scholarship also is granted to the African students here to come to study in the Russian universities and so on. So in terms of political and humanitarian assistance to many countries. For example, now also during the first section we mentioned, yeah, for example, the Russian supports to for Mali, for example, Niger, Burkina Faso, and so on. Yeah, just to deal with the security aspect that we have in these countries. You know, as I mentioned last time, you know, about 10 years. We have the international multinational forces in these three countries. They didn't deal with the situation in the region. But after, I mean, coming of the Russia, in just some months, yeah, 3 or 2 months, these situations have been solved. So then the situation in this country is more better than it was during these 10 years. So just to say that the cooperation between Russia and then African countries also continue to increase in this also sphere. And also in many spheres also that we can touch, for example, the Green Deal, yeah, also we know that last year the operation started from the 2023 to 2024 when the Russian government, yeah, by the decision of the President Vladimir Putin, yeah, they give the instruction to transfer free of charge to a number of African countries, yeah, the grain, 200 tons of grains to many African countries that include, for example, Mali, Burkina Faso, Zimbabwe, Eritrea, Somalia, and so on. So just to say that also at that time, now, Russia continued to cooperate with African countries in different spheres, I mean, including diplomatic channel and so on. And then Russia also is continuing to cooperate with African countries through different institutions, as we know, within the UN, yeah, also African Union, BRICS, we discussed here during the first session and so on. Just coming to the conclusion here quickly, so Russia Empire, the USSR also as well, and then the Russian Federation also have always maintained relation with the African peoples. Yeah, the relation between this relation, however, sometimes the extent may have been invisible compared to the Western countries because, of course, they have been here for many centuries. So Of course, yeah, this relation exists and then continue to be, developed at that time and nowadays. So this factor is a key positive moment in the also issue of Russia's relation with the African countries, as my colleague said before that, because Russia didn't have any colony here in Africa. That is a good positive signal for the cooperation between African countries and the Russian Federation. So sometimes, even as we can see, yeah, as Professor Panamarenko used to say, the cooperation of Russia with the African countries, sometimes, Russia try to do it sometimes, yeah, in its own detriment. Yeah, that's something also very important, because coming back when she was writing about the cooperation between Russia and Guinea, for example, how much support Russia for USSR that provide to the Guinea. So, and what Russia receive from that cooperation? Nothing. So, just to say that Russia continue its journey, its way with African countries and so on. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, and thanks for sticking to your 10 minutes. The next presenter will be Lwazi Somia, the Manager of Research and Development at SALO, the Southern African Liaison Office. Lwazi, you have 10 minutes.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm the last minute person who created the gender imbalance on this panel, so I apologize for my presence. We meet at a very, very interesting time, especially due to what happened in the past weekend, where the Southern African National Liberation Movements met. In their deliberations, they came up with a declaration, and Russia only appeared once in that entire declaration. And the only time Russia was mentioned was in reference to the United Russia Party gave a message of support, whilst there's an entire paragraph of issues around solidarity with different countries. What does that mean concerning Russia and Southern Africa's former liberation movements in terms of the relationship currently? And in particular, how does now Russia address what is currently happening within Southern Africa in terms of its bilateral relationship? Especially when you take into the consideration the following context, because this has to touch on what is the role of historic memory in the contemporary context within Southern Africa, in the African continent in general. Whether or not the beautiful things that Russia has done, that my brother has highlighted, either through the Soviet Union or post-Soviet Union, whether that's sufficiently enough to build soft power within Southern Africa going forward. And that is a very critical question to highlight, because number one, these are the following elements and context that Russia has to engage in. The first one is the decline of support for former liberation movements within Southern Africa in terms of electoral support, forcing them into various power arrangements and various arrangements that will bolster or supplement their reign or them being out of power. So now you're losing that element of historic memory with those in power within Southern Africa, losing that soft power attained during the Soviet Union era. The second aspect is the ideological dilution of governance within Southern Africa. What do I mean? As history and societies progress within Southern Africa, the historic context in terms of ideological position shifts as the material conditions in the world have shifted. For example, currently, the region itself is moving to a more transactional basis of engagement on the basis of how geopolitics is unfolding. And therefore, the ideological or historic memory that underpins Southern Africa's relationship with Russia is being diluted as the current context manifests, and as countries seek to get as many gains as possible out of the international system. The third aspect is an emergence of a new generation without attachments to the liberation history. So within populations within Southern Africa itself, young people are forgetting the role Russia has played historically, and therefore those ideological historic memory connections that the Russia has placated on and relied on in terms of its soft power is declining along with it. So what does Russia have to do now going forward? It is very, very easy to hop on concerning the liberation history of how Russia has played a role within Southern Africa. However, the more recent interventions of Russia have not necessarily been soft power interventions, but rather been hard power interventions that we've seen in many interventions happening within the continent. And therefore, what is the role of Russian soft power going forward within Southern Africa? And that is some of the questions that some of the scholars have to answer. Because we can highlight issues such as Russia currently, with South Africa, being the 46th largest exporter partner, and being the 39th largest source of imports within South Africa. That's very low concerning where the other BRICS member nations are laying in terms of a bilateral and multilateral arrangement. And this happens at a time where South Africa is actively challenging the global status quo, and especially concerning the reforms of multilateral fora, the ICJ case against Israel. However, at the back end of it, populations are not receiving some form of solidarity efforts, and therefore the soft power of Russia could play is highly diminished in the current context. So how do we now re-engage, how does Russia now re-engage within the African continent? By defining its diplomatic and foreign policy efforts in an effort to build its soft power within the Southern African region, rather than have this hard power initiative and relying solely and primarily based on the Soviet Union's legacy. Because currently what is happening is that even Russia's claim towards the legitimacy and the legacy of the Soviet Union is being challenged within Southern Africa. And therefore we should be very conscious of how even that legacy itself being challenged further diminishes Russia's soft power going forward. And in deliberations with certain political actors within South Africa, certain political parties claiming Russian support further damages Russia's image in the eyes of its constituents. Because the wrong people within South Africa, for example, are supportive of Russia when the potential larger border base could be in support of Russia's efforts internationally, especially concerning on a diplomatic and multilateral level. Therefore, there are many other. Therefore, Russia has to re-engage with itself on many fronts. First, concerning trade with Southern Africa and the African continent, because the current trade levels themselves are insufficient for them to carry or uplift Russia in terms of soft power and its appeal to broader populations. Number two, embark on new soft power initiatives within the African continent. As the legacy of the Soviet Union begins to diminish as a new generation of younger people enter politics and enter the public sphere, that legacy and historic memory itself will begin to diminish and further degrade Russian soft power within the region and continent. And the third component is further investment in attaching it to African agency initiatives such as the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. How does Russia now play a role in bolstering the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and Agenda 2063 by the African Union? If Russia is able to plug in these various spheres, fine, we send our students there and they come back. That's insufficient. A lot of countries are doing those things. And therefore, Africa now becomes a battle, a contestation, not necessarily of ideological principles, but what do we as Africans get by these bilateral and multilateral arrangements? And those are the fundamental questions that contemporary audiences and those perceiving state actors and state actions are wanting to see. Because currently, with the new trajectory around transactional diplomacy as a means of diplomatic engagements, soft power will become the carrying aspect of diplomatic engagements and bilateral relationships going forward. And therefore, how do you leverage that soft power as a means of achieving material benefits, not only for your own people domestically, but also within the region and the continent in general? And those are my contributions. Thank you.
Thank you, Lwazi. Very thought-provoking, and it cannot be business as usual because so many changes are happening within the region and on the ground. And the further we move away from that history, the more difficult it is to maintain those relationships. But going on what Adu said, you know, so many students studying in Russia is also part of a global movement for the minds of young people. There is academic diplomacy, there are scholarships, and everybody is playing this game. Europe, the US, Russia, China. So it gives great opportunities for our young people, but also I think contributes sometimes to the brain drain when they decide not to come back to South Africa. Okay, so now we're going to move over the Limpopo River to my colleague. No, not over. Yeah, further over the Limpopo, but that'll be a bit later. Up to East Africa, and we have Godwin Gonde, a lecturer at the Dr. Salim Ahmed Salim Center for Foreign Relations in Tanzania. I was just in your beautiful country at the beginning of last month, so the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, moderator. Good morning to you all. Good afternoon. Sawubona. I take this opportunity to thank the Valdai discussion group and the organizing committee for this opportunity. This is my first time in South Africa. Yes, I've been connecting, but I've never landed here. So being in South Africa to me means a lot, because South Africa has been in the minds of many Tanzanians since the time of liberation struggles. We had a tendency, when I was in primary school, we had a tendency of when a teacher enters in a class, we stand up and say, apartheid policy is an evil policy. Good morning, sir. So we used to say that because we were reminded on the role of African continent, mostly Tanzanian and other countries in the Southern Africa, on the liberation struggle of their fellow Africans. And in our foreign policy, the liberation, political liberation, was one among the key aspects of any kind of movement that the Tanzanians were doing. It was in a point, even Nelson Mandela was once granted citizenship of Tanzania, only to be saved from the wars. And with that type of relations that Tanzania, South Africa, and other countries in South Africa had, what the panelists tried to say, including Lwazi, because I'm a discussant here, trying to balance what Lwazi and Professor Adu explained in their perspective. When you see critically, there are two types of ideologies here. One from a beneficiary of the Russian relation in Africa, and the other representing the youth generation, the young generation, that is thinking on the future of this type of relation. And Lwazi tried to bring forward a number of questions on how we can move forward. And Professor also on his part tried to show where we came from the historical perspective and the relation where we came from and where we are heading, trying to find a better way that Russia and African states can move forward. So, as a discussant, to me, when I first tried to see the origin, the Russian-African relations from pre-colonial time, liberation struggles time, Cold War time, then post-Cold War time, and the Russian of today, things have been changing. And the current generation sometimes lack that history that the professor tried to say. And because in the future, these people with good history, these people with a good notion of relation, will no longer be there. The generation that questions everything, even validity of God himself, will be there, trying to see why do we need to have this type of relation. For instance, in Tanzania, we've been questioning. For instance, we had some struggles here in South Africa some years ago, xenophobia. And it took us time to believe that we had a role to play to liberate South Africans, because our fellow black people we are like mistreated here. But the elites, the people who were before apartheid, during apartheid policy, who were in power at that moment, I remember President Kikwete tried to make it clear that these things might happen, but history needs to be told. And therefore, the relation that was there, is currently now, and moving forward, needs to be in a way that both parties, Russia and African states, are benefited in it. Luazi tried to bring forward some areas in which Russia should now focus, including soft power, and I cement on that. Now the world is moving towards soft diplomacy. The presence of the Russians was not seen directly in the streets of Africa. It was only seen in terms of state-centric type of relations, but not people-centric type of relations. And that we are moving towards that trend, that even people from the grassroots can know the presence of Russians in their projects, in their lives, in whatever. And those who are given education, Russian education, how are they using that type of education to liberate their fellow Africans? If you may allow me to read you a quotation, if I still have 1 minute, sir, or two. You have a minute. Okay. Julius Nyerere once wrote, and I quote, "Those who receive the privilege of education, therefore, they have a duty to repay the sacrifice which others have made. They are like the man who has been given all the food available in a starving village in order that he might get strength to bring back supplies back from a distant place. If he takes this food and does not bring help to his brothers, he is a traitor." End of quote. Any type of relation and benefit that you are given should be beneficial to you and to the community you are serving. And that should remain in every person here inside. They say you cannot bite the hand that feeds you. And therefore, diplomacy allows. I'll come from the Center for Foreign Relations, whereby diplomacy is our key subject. Allows interaction, but any kind of interaction should be of a positive side for both parties. Ending up my talk is, how do we learn from the past? And from the past, how can we move forward? Russia had been involving in this type of relation. We have seen after the collapse of Soviet Russia, for more than 15 years, was silent in African politics because it had to concentrate on internal affairs. But now they are back. And they're back, but they're facing the devastated Africa, which grumbled to capture other partners. And in that kind of grumble, some countries found themselves lost in that trend. And we are learning real politics now. We see it because of the technology. We are learning the real politics. And we know what does it mean by having two friends and allies. And that it remains the call. The African proverb, when I'm winding up, from Chinua Achebe, he said, "As long as the bed shakes regularly, that home is at peace." And therefore, any kind of relation that Africa and Russia have should continue, be shaking, finding new opportunities, finding new ways, so that we can have a peaceful trend together. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I won't comment on shaking beds. But just a couple of things. Luazi was talking about the low trade between South Africa and Russia. If I'm correct, Turkey actually does more trade with Africa than Russia does. And then you mentioned soft power. I think a big blow was struck to Russia in terms of its soft power when DSTV, our satellite channel, our satellite provider, MultiChoice, decided to, it took Russia Today, RT, off our satellite package. And if you go onto channel 407, it basically says, because the link comes from Europe, it's been cut and we can't bring it. Now, many have said that that is a propaganda channel. The answer I've heard from Russia is that, well, is CNN or Sky News any less of a propaganda channel? Not passing judgment on that, but I do think this is a blow to the Russians getting their narrative out in African countries. Okay, our next presenter, or our next respondent, is indeed my neighbor from north of the Limpopo, Munyaradzi Nyakudya, who's the chairperson at the Department of Peace, Security and Society at the University of Zimbabwe. You have 7 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm audible now. Thank you, Steve, and good afternoon, colleagues. It's quite a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to come to this very august gathering. I will approach my presentation the manner Godwin did, where I want to respond to issues that are raised by our main presenters. I'm a historian by training, and I want to appreciate Adu's very succinct historical presentation that he gave pertaining to Russia-Africa relations, how he traces these relations from way back in history, not just from the 70s, late 60s, when Africa is seeking independence. Very important, because we learn from history. It helps us to understand the present, of course, and to shape the future. And I would also want then to go further and look at the hard-hitting questions that Lazwe has asked. But coming from Zimbabwe and beyond the Limpopo, as he says, much of my case study would be not South Africa, but elsewhere, because we don't want this to be purely South Africa-centered. It's about Africa as well. Let me start by going to what Steve said in his opening remarks. There's a danger of romanticizing history. Why am I saying this? We want to believe that Russia-Africa relations are some kind of a straitjacket, homogeneous kind of relationship. You'll find that if we're going to use Zimbabwe as a case study, compared with other African countries' relationship with Russia, there are quite some significant differences which members might not be aware of. You'll note that Russia supported the Zimbabwe liberation struggle. That's a given. But unlike in Mozambique, unlike in South Africa, unlike in Angola, the movement that was supported by the Russians did not come to power in Zimbabwe. That's a very critical point. The Russians were supporting Zimbabwe African People's Union, led by Joshua Nkomo, whilst the Chinese were supporting Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwe African National Union. Both movements were fighting for liberation. We are cognizant of the challenges, struggles that happened in the past between China and Russia. And this affected how they then responded to support of liberation movements in Zimbabwe. So why are we saying this? We are saying this because you will notice that when Zimbabwe attained its independence in 1980, Robert Mugabe actually resisted having Russian embassy in Soviet Union embassy in Harare for 2-3 years. Only later did this embassy get established. So we are talking about Russian-Zimbabwean relations that did not start on a level that would expect for a liberation. I mean, a country that had been liberated with support from Russia. Yes, the party that Russia supported might not have come to power, but they had made their contribution. That's a very important point. We are not discounting that. But ultimately, ZAPU and ZANU came together. So we can say the Russians, friends are now within the ruling party as well, because ZAPU are also part of the ruling party now. So there's a kind of normalization of that relationship. So does that explain the current relationships now? I think what Prof. Ado said helps to explain these things. History is not static. We have had changes, shifts. Russia and Zimbabwe today, I think, stand as two of the most sanctioned countries in the world. So we have something very important in common there, and that should bring these two countries much closer together. This is why you find today the cooperation between Russia and Zimbabwe has strengthened a lot. Now that it has strengthened, some of the questions are, how is it impacting on the people on the ground? What has been the impact? In what ways has Russia-Zimbabwe relations been noticed? We have talked about humanitarian assistance, we've talked about political, etc., etc. I want to analyze these relations in terms of what's on the ground at the moment and see how this helps in shaping Russia-Zimbabwe, by extension Africa, relations. It is not a secret that the Russians have come in terms of trade cooperation, investments. I think they're doing a lot in trying to get into mining, into energy. We have seen some cultural exchanges, some cultural cooperation. We have seen quite a number in terms of education exchanges within education, scholarships to Zimbabweans. So there's a lot that is happening on the ground. But much of it, I have to be the advocate, what do you call it? Devil's advocate here and say, yes, and say, and I think someone mentioned it, it's Prof. Adu, visibility is not there on the ground. Why? Because by and large, and I think this is what Maya said at some point, referring to BRICS, BRICS getting elitist. The relationship between Russia and Zimbabwe has been criticized in quite a number of circles for being kind of elitist, if I am to use that kind of language. It is almost like it's about, it's at state level where the leaderships define this, and it doesn't cascade to the grassroots, where people in Zimbabwe can say, yes, the Russians are mining here. Besides our resources getting transported outside as raw materials, what are we benefiting?
Prof, can I ask you to wrap up?
All right, thank you. What are we benefiting? This is at the community level. So there is this need for, I think these are the questions that Lasgo was talking about. This soft politics needs to be emphasized more. I'm not saying the state cooperation is not important. It is very important, but I am stressing the need for this to cascade to the grassroots, where the common people will see the benefits of cooperating with Russia. In terms of, if Russia is mining here or investing in minings, how are they plowing back? People don't seem to be noticing that. So I will end on that note. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Just to do a little advertisement for SIRE, if you look on our website, you'll find a paper that looks at Russia, Zimbabwe relations, Russia-Tanzania relations, also Mozambique and Zambia. So there are two different papers that are on our website that you can have a look at. Okay, our final input is going to come from Russia, from Denis Degtarev, who is the senior researcher at the Institute of Africa of the Russian Academy of Sciences. You have the floor.
Thanks a lot. First, I would give some kind of disclaimers. Number one, I will speak exclusively about the future, though I am personally strongly committed to our common liberation legacy. Second, I will speak about concrete, fresh, new cases of soft power cooperation, what Lozi recommended us to implement. Third, I won't speak about other external partners because it's up to Africans themselves to make an assessment. So today, one of the most dynamically developing areas of humanitarian cooperation between Russia and African countries is higher education. And the total number of African students studying in Russia already exceeds Soviet figures. A number of interesting initiatives have been implemented. For example, the Russian African Network University, then the open education centers of the Ministry of Education. So every regional pedagogical or normal university of Russia got a task to open education centers in 2 African countries. And all those universities, they did it. Then, we have scholars who promote learning African languages, and they already published textbooks, for example, from Bambara language to Russian language, right? And also many Russian business operators are engaged, and they open so-called non-governmental Russian houses. And a number of Russian universities, and these are leading universities in the world, they are now working on opening their campuses in Africa. I am the editor-in-chief of the only Russian scientific journal entirely devoted to Africa. And on the pages of this concrete issue, we summarize the best practices of Russian-African cooperation in the field of higher education. And all papers we publish in 2 languages, Russian and English. Russia, like the Soviet Union, has never been involved in the brain drain from Africa, what Stephen just told about. Almost all African students leave Russia after completing their studies. More than 95% of African students now, not only in Soviet period, but now they leave Russia. And in this regards, my esteemed colleague, Yao Nikes, he is an exception. He decided to stay in Russia, right? But I would say that even during Soviet period, there were some also exceptional cases, like our prof Negusi Kasai from Ethiopia, right, who also stayed in Russia. But this exceptional case only confirms the general rule. But not only quantitative indicators are important, education should not be reactive, but proactive towards market demands and modern challenges. So what do I mean? It's necessary to teach in those specialties that will be in demand, not today, but tomorrow. It's necessary to train personnel to form national and regional value chains, what Pilani was talking about, and to overcome the negative consequences of the center-periphery development model of African countries. For this, it is important to improve national strategic planning mechanisms in African countries, but it is a matter of sovereignty, and Russia never intervenes into this. But what we could do else is to develop scientific cooperation which allows us to foresee what are real priorities in different spheres. Russia and African countries now are actively engaged in this, and Russian scholars like us today, right, frequently visit the continent. Also, scientific cooperation between journals is important, and I would say that our journal publish African authors in every issue. And our editorial board includes 13 members from 13 African scholars. 4 of them are from South Africa. And I know that my colleagues actively contribute to Politicon, SAIA, journal of South African Journal of International Relations, not only to issues related to Russia-Africa relations, but also like the fresh new example on a special issue on West Africa. Me, not yet. Science should assist to solve practical problems facing our countries and not to divert scarce national resources to some, fashionable, trendy topics. And in this regard, it's important to develop direct bilateral scientific ties, including bilateral research grants competition. When we form joint research teams, but we respect sovereignty in what way? When Russian side finance Russian scholars, African side finance African scholars. But at the same time, the most interesting submissions are selected jointly. And this is we already have such an experience which is very fruitful with South Africa, and I hope we will develop it with other African countries. So I am convinced that effective educational and scientific cooperation with Russia is useful for strengthening the sovereign development of African countries, what Fyodor was speaking about. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very, very much. Just two things before we get into the questions that came to mind. One is when Gustavo and I were in Russia in May, I think, last year, we met one of the veterans of Russia-Africa Studies, Professor Vladimir Shubin. And one of the things that he said is that it's very difficult to learn Russian in Africa now, that many previous institutions that existed to give Russian language teaching no longer exist. So that might be something to pay attention to. And then also on that trip, what struck me a lot, speaking to academics, was that since the war started in 2022, many Russian academics felt a little bit isolated, given that partnerships with Western universities and research institutions, many of them were cut, many of them were cancelled. I think this has only renewed Russia's interests in places like Africa, where it is possible to have those cooperations and those collaborations. And it's a pattern that we've seen as Western engagement with Russia diminishes, Russia looks elsewhere, and other places also look to Russia. Okay, we're going to have about half an hour, 25 minutes of discussion. We did advertise that lunch was going to be at 1:30, and I want to stick to that. So we'll start with Nuhan here, then David, Oleg, and Pilani. Let's go, please.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and thank you for all of you for that really fruitful discussion. But my question, not question, but just to add the session to Professor Nikes, as you are you having a mutual hat, you are, as you mentioned, you are African and Russian at the same time. So what do you think about the main challenges for Russia in Africa? Stephen mentioned one of the challenges, the language and etc. But what do you think? What are other challenges you say that really slowing down, I will not mention blocked, but slowing down the cooperation between Russia and the African countries?
Thank you. David?
Oh, thank you. I think the historical element is quite interesting. If you look at South Africa, Russians in particular played a critical role. As far back as 1899 to 1902, I mean, we had Russians coming on the side of the Afrikaners in this country. So, as you said in the opening, complicated. Our history is also complicated. That even though there's anti-apartheid, the so-called Anglo-Boer War, we call it a South African War, had an anti-imperialist element to it. So we also celebrate Derare in a complicated way, because there was an anti-imperialist dimension to Derare. So Derare song comes out, we sing along. And the Russians came here, 225 to 200. You go to Bloemfontein, they still celebrate. There's a history to that. The Russians were involved. This is prior the liberation stories. Even now, on the question of rugby, I think we would need to see more. When I look at Russian colleagues with serious rugby physique, so I think we need to look into those issues and strengthen BRICS and Africa-China relation. But on a serious, oh yeah, of course. Yes. Let's go beyond these issues and ask a core question. The role that Russia and Soviet Union played both in the First and Second World War, the sacrifice that we made, I think we need to recognize that led to the liberation struggles, whether we like it or not, the opening up of anti-imperialism. So it's important for us to look at this history in a much more serious way. But the biggest benefit that Africa got from Russia during the liberation was the AK-47, let's face it, and be very direct. And if Russia gave us AK-47 for liberation, we need to ask the question, what is the new AK-47 that Russia can assist Africa? I think we need to open new frontiers of solidarity to consolidate cooperation. It's the economic front, the scientific. Russia is big on space. We want to see Africans in space alongside their Russian counterparts. We asked the Chinese, and they delivered on that. Their movements around. I know Russia is also playing heavy on space with Africa, but I think more needed. We also want to see something that was mentioned in terms of beneficiation by Dr. Mtembu, the beneficiations, bringing these beneficiations instead of just continuing taking raw material out in a colonial belt of some sort. We need to see more of that in the forefront on issues of digital integration, more work that is needed. But at the end of the day, I think Africa has its own interests. And as much as it goes to China, it goes to the United States. It needs that room that it can be friends with anyone, whether it's Americans or the British or the Chinese. So the Russians, when we look at the Russians, I think we want to see the goods, more of these goods, much more here at home, and avoid getting into the mercenary issue and regulate that. I think recent developments are welcome, where the mercenaries has been regulated to some extent. I might be wrong, but I think we need to see more of that. We are friends, so I'm being very direct and frank. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Oleg?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to react what Professor Nyakudia said very rightly. And it's a difficult question, and sometimes Russian journalists pose it to me, and it's quite dialectical to answer it. So if the raw materials from Zimbabwe or from other African countries were extracted, let's say, by the British, we name them colonialists or neo-colonialists. But if the same raw materials are extracted now by Russia or by China, what is the difference? Why we don't name us or the Chinese the same neo-colonialists? And sure, there are, you can find some explications that we are different, and for example, one of the Russian economic strategy in Africa now is promote exactly industrialization at the place, not only extracting raw materials, but to build some factories, to build some infrastructure. And a big part of the action plan of Russia-Africa Summit is dedicated exactly to this, and it's connected to the education as well, to prepare technical staff for those future factories and so on. But absolutely right, because it is not visible for an ordinary citizen. And when I was in Harare, the Chinese presence is visible. The Russian one, not so much, I would say. And here, when we arrived in the airport, Oliver Tambo Airport in Johannesburg just now, we've seen very huge banner promoting some Chinese banking company. So the Chinese is visible to everybody who is coming to Johannesburg. Russia is not visible. And that's a real question, yeah. What is the difference between Russian and Chinese from one part and British, French, and Americans from another part? And there is another question, how to become it visible, how to become it understandable for ordinary local citizens. Okay, Russians are here, the Chinese are here, but how beneficial that could be, that's very, and thank you very much. So,
thanks. I mean, ultimately they need to deliver. That makes for a lot of difference. Okay, Pilani? There's anybody in the back row who we haven't heard from so much? Okay, Gustavo, I can see you. Please, in the back row, come into the conversation. Pilani.
No, excellent. Thanks, colleagues. Just one observation, you know, as I was listening. So I hear the figures, right? Over 34,000, the importance of context and sort of contextualization and, you know, of any sort of figures. You know, you hear the figure 34,000 African students in Russia. And you're like, ah, okay, that's interesting. 34,000 students, that's a lot, right? Then we get some context. You say, the number of African students in today's Russia exceeds the Soviet era. Then my eyebrows like, ah, even more interesting, you know, because you know, I'm just, you know, it's just an observation sort of that I made. When we put sort of figures and things like that, 34,000 seems a lot, yes, it seems, you know, commendable, but when you place it in a context of saying, actually, it even exceeds the number of the Soviet era, it actually even seems, you know, and feels, you know, much more. So communication is important. Communication is both appeals, I guess, to the mental, but there's an emotiveness also that's important in that context. I think I agree with the points around the potential in terms of education, education cooperation. One other area I think that's often, I think, underutilized in this relationship between Russia and Africa. You know, we think about Russia as a sort of a hard power, we think about the military and all of that. But I mean, Russia is also an agricultural power. And I mean, we in a continent which has the largest, you know, sort of unutilized arable land in the world. This is where an agricultural revolution needs to be taking place. This is where you achieve impact that goes beyond just the hard power. This is where you reach communities. This is where you between rural areas and cities and all of that. So the potential of Russia cooperation with Africa in the agricultural space is massive, you know, in terms of actually achieving real impact, in terms of technology, cooperation, and I think this is really an area that's underutilized. Even if we go to like the AK-47, for instance, we know Africa buys ammunition from Russia. Russia is an important supplier for Africa. But even in that space, there could be certain countries where Russia could say, why don't we produce you know, some of those weapons with African producers, you know, so that yes, you're transferring technology, but also then you're feeding to Africa's sort of industrialization drive. So even in that space, there's potential.
Thanks. I'm not sure we need more guns on the continent, though, to be honest.
Well, at least those that we're making ourselves. Yeah?
I think we have a lot. Gustavo, and if there's anybody else who'd like to come in. Yes, Aaron and Sanusha. Okay. Gustavo, Sanusha, Aaron, Sanusha.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I think this is a fascinating discussion because it brings us to some reflections of where's the world now, where is Africa now, and how do we compare with previous decades? Because I think part of the risk that countries like Russia have coming into Africa is expecting that it can revive its old Soviet presence within the continent. And I think it's not something that I see present in official discourses, or it's something that is directly mentioned. But very often I feel in conversations, in reading statements, that it's very much implied. So there is this sense of, there is a new generation of Africanists rising in places like Moscow and St. Petersburg, and I think that is an important first step. Because if we don't understand each other enough, the policies and positions will very much try to mimic what it has been done in the past. Because there is one fundamental difference, many, but I wanted to highlight one fundamental difference period. That is the issue of choices. And I don't think we should underestimate that. And that is not a transactional presentation of the idea of choices. But the high number of players that we've seen increasingly engaging within the continent makes the conversations less exclusive, either or. As much as we see a US administration that keeps reinforcing the idea that you have to choose us over everyone else, the reason why very few countries are effectively doing that is that no one really trusts that any of our superpowers are that big that they can provide us, countries, everything that we would like and need. Meaning that this talk about comparative advantages, I think it's something that needs to be very seriously considered. There is a dichotomy, I think, on the contemporary relations of Russia and Africa that is historically very meaningful, and that resonates till today, but it still remains very shallow. Our trade is very small. We're talking about, what, $20, $25 billion between Russia and Africa on an annual basis, with Egypt by far being the largest. If you exclude Egypt and perhaps Algeria, this would be 60, 70% of the trade. Meaning that the statistics that Loazi presented, it's not only relevant for South Africa, but it's relevant for the rest of the continent. There are, of course, the historical military cooperation arrangements, and we talk a lot about Valdai and Africa Corps, Wagner and Africa Corps and so on. But there is a continuation of that interaction from a defense point of view between Russia and African countries. How do we look into the key priorities that the continent is setting itself now? It's about supply chains, its positioning in global trade, integration. And these, I think, are areas probably far more meaningful in terms of matching what the demands are, because the continent understands that in order to remain competitive, or to become, not even to remain, to become competitive within a much more fragmented space, we have no other choice than to integrate from within. And that is why you may have a lot of issues between African countries and the US, but when the Lobito corridor started being discussed, it was very well accepted, because immediately led to the Chinese to redevelop Tanzania to Zambia railways that repositions the continent in a whole new boom that is changing not only of the global order, but also there is a fundamental change on the types of products that we sell and products that we buy.
Thank you. And then Sanusha, and we'll back to the presenter for one. Is there anybody else? Okay, you can do Sanusha first and then Aaron.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the panelists and discussants. I think it was very informative. My point is very quick, and it picks up a little bit on what Palani was saying, but also what Gustavo was saying. Wazi's point of departure, that there's a younger generation in Africa, and perhaps I don't know enough about the younger generation in Russia, from the African context. Where are they aspiring to? Where are they looking towards in terms of their kind of understanding of the world, but from a cultural perspective? Because part of the panel discussion is about not just scientific and liberation struggle kind of synergies. If there's a generation that's remembering the old, what are they remembering the old about, right? But the younger generation seem to have a very different kind of view of the world. And how much of that is informed by the number of African students that are studying in Russia? Are they the enablers of Russian soft power in Africa? Are they taking African culture, African agency into Russia? You don't find many African young people wanted to aspire to Chinese pop culture, but definitely to American pop culture, and it's still very much a pivot. So just in that context, just some reflection on how that is also a driver of this kind of new type of memory or a new type of soft power that will also define
Center for the Qatar South Africa Center for Peace and Intercultural Dialogue. And my question probably brings together Munyoradzi and Dennis. And I'm thinking about the fact that often sovereignty and liberation are not always compatible. And what happens when they're not? Like, what would Russia's perspective be when they really are not compatible? Liberation of who? States or societies? And obviously Zimbabwe presents a complex scenario on this front. And I'm wondering, it's not specific to the topic here, but it's hard for me to think about liberation movements and humanitarian agenda without thinking about peace and security. And I guess the question is, as a new rules-based order takes shape, what will Russia bring to the table in terms of the type of peace and security it seeks to promote and support in Africa? And to what degree is there support for addressing root causes and prevention? And what does that look like from a Russian perspective? Through which levers and mechanisms? Director Birachevsky, spoke really passionately about supporting Global South and South African leadership in G20 and so forth. And so, yeah, I think, I'm still wondering, what does that look like in terms of a peace and security agenda? We know that BRICS doesn't deliberately speak about peace and security, but they do in many cases, right? And these issues are not distinguishable oftentimes, right? They're very interrelated. So yeah, it would be great to hear a bit more. Just building on the last speaker's question, I mean, I did my PhD in Zimbabwe on the National Liberation War Veterans Association and the National Constitutional Assembly, looking at the two social movements. And at the time, even after that, there was a lot of government effort to train youth to maintain a liberation theology. And it would be interesting to hear how that's evolving. Thanks.
Thanks. Okay, the last Last word will be from Mandira, and then we'll go to the panel. I'm not even sure we'll have time for the panel. If there's somebody on the panel who is dying to say something, please indicate. I'm not going to just go to everybody, but go ahead.
Thanks, Chair. I think I've been doing a bit of reflecting as the discussions have been going on, and, you know, the word "we need Russia to deliver" has come up. And I think trying to kind of move away from this tangential kind of engagement to something of more substance. How are we as South Africa, the South African government, and other African governments thinking about this? Are we getting our different departments, you know, to talk? Are we getting DTIC and DIRCO to the table? You know, again, it's the age-old question. David will be aware, Sanusha, Palani, we often talk about where's the China strategy? Where's our Russia strategy? You know, we're saying Russia needs to deliver, but if we go to the negotiating table and they're like, okay, you want us to deliver on what? And we are like, oh, you know, give us some infrastructure. But if we don't meet them with concrete kind of points of what we'd like, what would want delivered, you know, where's the market research? What are we doing? If we know they're an agricultural powerhouse, you know, let's talk about industrializing our agriculture. You know, we shouldn't have a food security problem on the continent. We've got China now expanding in agriculture. Why don't we look at some form of trilateral cooperation in that sector between China, Russia, and African countries? So I think we're all aware now, like we're beyond this kind of talk shop. We need concrete actions, and the next step, I think, is to think about how do we get to that level. That's just my opinion.
Okay, thank you. I'm looking at the panel and my stomach is rumbling. But Dennis, you can come in.
Okay, thanks. In fact, real weapon is science. It's not AK-47, but science, because science could give you material capabilities and then you could say no to to proposals that are not good for your country. But you have either brain drain or like real scholars, real scientists, especially in technical sciences, right? Sometimes they're considered dangerous, like it happened in Iran. Then, you know, I recently was in Guinea-Conakry with Russian scientists, and you know, I had some idea that I understood that probably Soviet project was one of the strongest modernization projects in the world. And in Guinea, we met some, you know, ruins of this project. And I mean, it's the case for South Africa because here is much better, right? But there in Guinea, we met that there were no other partners who would continue those modernization efforts which were made by the Soviet Union. And now, like Russian researchers, they come back to Guinea and they relaunch those efforts that were done in 1980s, etc. What other modernization projects we have? And I try to answer your question, right? We have the case of Afghanistan. Now we have the same in Syria. And if African Corp will lose, we will get the same in Sahel with JNIM. Do you want this modernization project to realize in African continent? I'm not sure. So once again, the best, probably the best solution what Russia could propose to Africa is strong science. And first of all, me, I am a specialist like you in social science, but first of all, it is technical science. Thanks a lot.
In the interest of time, Lwazi, you'll have the last word.
Okay, I'll be very quick. The argument around higher education is a very elitist argument. And it's not beneficial to around 89% of young people in this country alone, let alone the rest of the continent. So if you want to discuss issues around further deepening cooperation, we should not leave it at an elitist discussion around, we're going to take your elitist children to Russia and they'll come back and they will influence your political space. Let's not leave it at that. Scientific cooperation, yes, I agree with that. But there's more that the bilateral relationship can hold. There are technological transfers, further increases in trade, further increases in infrastructure investments within the continent, the skills transfers, et cetera, et cetera. So there's so much potential in this relationship, but narrowing it down to higher education and science, et cetera, solely leaves it at an elitist discussion.
And on that, thank you very much to the panel. Please give them a hand. I'm especially honored that very few people took up the opportunity to speak again, so thank you. Gustavo, we're going to break now till 2:30, and that ends the, yes,